Well, I recently read about a high-ranking prelate in the Catholic Church who was remarking to the media what kind of a church he wants to see in the future, especially as it relates to the clergy. He was saying he wanted to see a clergy who fit in, who focused more attention on doing the kinds of things that lay people do, like dressing casually and going bowling, rather than fixating on tradition and dogma, which is sort of revealing of what he thinks of the laity also. Like, these are the kinds of things that the silly and superficial laity like to do. And frankly, I find this kind of opining from those with real serious authority a bit just frustrating. As a Catholic, I'm not really interested in what Steve, the private citizen's opinions are. I want to know what Archbishop Stephen teaches by virtue of his apostolic authority. That wasn't this particular prelate's name, by the way. When someone has an office with legitimate authority, I think it's negligent if they avoid actually exercising that authority, instead preferring to give interviews or make public remarks that have no authoritative content in them. And this is especially frustrating when the actually authoritative teachings of the Catholic Church stand in contrast to some of those remarks. Like, as an analogy, imagine a dean at a college who addresses new students about the things he would like to see happen in his school, but he doesn't make those preferences official. He doesn't put them through the rigorous process of having them defined as laws or rules in the school. He just mentions them in an offhand way. Like, what if he said, I'd really like it if my students dressed formally on campus, but then never actually made it a rule while simultaneously he hands out, or the school hands out, a handbook that explicitly says there's no dress code. Wouldn't you think that at best that was frustrating, and at worst that's an actual abuse of his authority? If you want to make something a rule, then use the authority that you have. That's why it exists. Don't make side remarks that have no standing or relation to the exercise of your authority. That's just confusing. And that's what I feel like we have in this whole magisterium of the media, when instead of actually using the magisterial offices and the conduits of that teaching, we have prelates all over the place speaking to the media, sharing their opinions. I also think it's revealing because doing anything in an official way means there's going to be some accountability for your attempts to create whatever reforms you might want. But if you just avoid those checks and balances by choosing to make casual remarks to get what you want, that seems like an abuse of power to me. And the thing about this particular prelate's remarks is that the church's official teachings actually do seem to contradict it. As it relates to this question of priestly conduct and decorum, Canon 285, Section 1 says that clerics are to refrain completely from all those things which are unbecoming of their state, according to the prescripts of particular law. Okay, well, that seems obvious enough. But then Section 2 goes on to say, clerics are to avoid those things which, although not unbecoming, are nevertheless foreign to the clerical state. Which is to say that there are behaviors and activities and features of secular life which are foreign to the clerical state and which are not foreign to the laity. Now, that's still a little bit ambiguous, but the spirit of what I think it's trying to define here is that far from just fitting in and blending in with the laity, clerics are to pursue perfection by virtue of having been consecrated and distinguished by their holiness and devotion to spiritual things in their conduct, in their dress, and in their leisure. What it never says is that they should just be doing whatever the laity are doing. And you don't have to accept my particular interpretation for it, because the church does discuss this elsewhere, like the Council of Trent, which I think is quite relevant to the moment we are living in the church. Because that council was a response to the Protestant Reformation, which was at least partially, if not mostly, inspired by clerical corruption at all levels. People were so scandalized by the lives and behavior of priests, bishops, and even popes that it wasn't hard for them to conclude that maybe in trying to establish this class of holy men, we seem to have created a class of religious conmen. And now we're living in a time in which the scandalously loose morals of many in the clergy have led to one of the worst scandals in the church's history, and a perception of the clergy that inspires most people to wonder the same things that they were wondering around the time of the Protestant Reformation, but also to keep their children close by. So the Council of Trent, appreciating the desperate need for reform among the clergy, said that because the laity look to the clergy as an example of what they are aiming to become, that is, saints, frankly, that everything about their lives should be permeated by dignity and piety, including their clothing, their speech, their leisure, the kinds of activities that they participate in, even the way that they walk. It goes on to say that they should refrain from secular things like luxury, dances, gambling, and even sports. In short, it says that their lives should be distinct from the laity and held to a much higher standard of dignity and moderation. Now, I'm not saying that the clergy should be too pompous or too holy to join us, the rest of us, in our daily lives, but I am saying that relatability, to whatever degree it's a good thing, should be way down the list of priorities of what a priest hopes to cultivate in his character. And it needs to be conditioned by what the church admonishes priests to be in her official magisterial teachings, and not the casual remarks of some bishop. And in thinking about this whole topic reminded me of a scene I recently witnessed of a young father who was spending, let's say, quality time with his solitary child out in public. Now, this could have been an example of a father who was really going the extra mile and putting in a solid effort to be a good dad, but I couldn't help be struck by the suspicion that this was actually a father who was just visiting a child that he doesn't live with. Because for so many of us, this is tragically an all too familiar scene that it isn't that hard to recognize when we see it. We know it from experience. Many of us were raised by parents that were much more intent on being our pals and our comrades than being our parents. But who among us needs friends that are 30 years older than us? We need wisdom, we need knowledge, we need to be initiated into a culture and into a way of life that works and that has worked in the past. But the generations of the 20th and the 21st centuries have opted not to do that because, I don't know, it's too hard, or because they convince themselves that skepticism of the past is some kind of a virtue. But if we're being honest, it's a lot easier to just watch TV with someone than it is to mentor them, than to educate them and to correct them. So we've now had generations of parents in which too many of them have opted for the easier relationship than the hard work of actually raising up a new generation. And to be honest, this is a question of greed for me. So-called progressivism is just greed draped in self-congratulatory rhetoric about liberation from the past. It's greed because past generations inherited a tradition and a way of life that, of course, is never going to be perfect, but it worked for them. It enabled them to have all the successes and the prosperity that they take for granted. And then, instead of passing that knowledge and that culture onto the next generation, they just kept it for themselves and gaslit us by saying that it was actually a bad thing, full of all kinds of evils and injustices, while simultaneously being all too happy to use it to their advantage. They made tradition a bad word so that they didn't have to be responsible to pass it on, even though they fully benefited from it. We don't need fathers, whether biological or spiritual, that will relate to us. We need mentors who will share the wealth of their inheritance, which is exactly what tradition is. Because there's nothing more degrading and patronizing than an educated person equipped with knowledge, skills, and wisdom who, instead of sharing that with an uneducated person, just decides to relate to that person by feigning the same ignorance that they don't actually possess themselves. In other words, they lie to them in order to be more appealing to them, while doing nothing to benefit them, when this is the exact thing that children need from their parents. So to neglect giving it to them is a pretty severe injustice in my estimation, and certainly not an act of love. Hey, thanks for watching that. If you made it this far, it's either because you fell asleep or because you really liked me. And if it's the latter, I feel okay asking if you would consider helping me out by subscribing, liking, sharing, and if you really like me, consider supporting my channel by joining the reinforcements, where you can get opportunities to interact with me and others personally. You can sign up at brianholdsworth.com relatable.ca. And if you're looking to buy or move, consider using Real Estate for Life. They are a network of real estate agents that will share your pro-life and pro-family beliefs, which are pretty important when it comes to making a big decision like finding a house. You can find them at realestateforlife.com.